The dusty boots of Jake Morrison had walked across more ranch land than most men see in a lifetime, but nothing could have prepared him for what he'd discover when Martha Henderson removed her silver wig on their wedding night. What started as a marriage of convenience in the small town of Cedar Ridge, Montana, would unravel secrets that had been buried for 30 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Henderson ranch as Jake Morrison adjusted his worn Stetson and surveyed the property that would soon become his responsibility. At 42, he'd spent the better part of 2 decades working cattle, ranches from Texas to Wyoming, never staying in one place long enough to call it home. But Cedar Ridge felt different somehow, and Martha Henderson's proposal had caught him off guard in ways he was still trying to understand. Martha stood on the wraparound porch of the weathered farmhouse, her silver hair neatly arranged beneath, a wide-brimmed hat, watching Jake examine the fence line with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent his life working the land. At 60, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who'd faced life's hardships head-on and emerged stronger for it. The lines around her eyes spoke of years spent squinting against the Montana sun, and her hands, though aged, still possessed the strength that came from decades of ranch work. The Henderson place had seen better days. Paint peeled from the barn's exterior, and several sections of fencing sagged under the weight of harsh winters and neglected maintenance. The property sprawled across nearly 300 acres of prime grazing land, but without the manpower to maintain it properly. Weeds had begun to reclaim the pastures, and the small herd of cattle that remained looked thin despite the approaching summer season. Jake had arrived in Cedar Ridge 3 weeks earlier, following a lead on work from a friend in Billings. The town itself was nothing special, a main street lined with the usual collection of businesses that kept small communities alive: a diner, a hardware store, a bank that had seen better days, and a post office that doubled as the social hub, where gossip traveled faster than the mail. Population barely cracked 800 souls, most of whom had lived there their entire lives and knew each other's business better than their own. The Copper Creek Saloon sat at the far end of Main Street, its wooden sign creaking in the constant wind that swept down from the mountains. It was there that Jake first heard Martha Henderson's name, whispered in conversations that stopped abruptly when strangers walked by. The locals spoke of her with a mixture of respect and curiosity, a widow who'd been running her late husband's ranch alone for the past 8 years, struggling to keep the operation afloat while dealing with mounting debts and the relentless pressure of corporate buyers who circled her property like vultures. Frank Henderson had been something of a legend in these parts, a third-generation rancher who'd built his operation from the ground up, expanding the family's modest holdings into one of the largest spreads in the county. But Frank had also been a gambler, both with cards and with business ventures that didn't always pan out. When a massive blizzard in 2015 killed nearly half his herd, followed by a drought that lasted 2 seasons, the financial strain had broken. More than just his bank account, it had broken his spirit. Martha had watched her husband of 32 years fade away like morning mist, his once booming voice reduced to whispers as he sat on the porch, staring out at land that no longer felt like his own. When Frank passed in his sleep on a cold February morning, he left behind a woman who was determined to honor his memory by keeping the ranch in the family, even if she had to marry a stranger to do it. The advertisement Martha placed in the Billings Gazette was straightforward and businesslike. Widow seeks experienced ranch hand for marriage of convenience. Must be willing to work hard and ask few questions. Serious inquiries only. The responses had been fewer than she'd hoped and more colorful than she'd expected. Most of the men who replied were either too old to be of much help or too young to understand the gravity of what she was proposing. Jake's letter had stood out for its simplicity and honesty. He didn't make grand promises or paint romantic pictures of their future together. Instead, he'd written 3 short paragraphs explaining his experience, his willingness to work, and his understanding that their arrangement would be based on mutual benefit rather than affection. He'd included references from his previous employers, and a single photograph that showed a weathered face beneath a cowboy hat, eyes that had seen enough of the world to appreciate both its beauty and its harsh realities. Their first meeting took place at Murphy's Diner on a Thursday afternoon when the lunch crowd had thinned out and they could talk without drawing too much attention. Martha had chosen a corner booth where she could watch the door, a habit developed from years of living alone on an isolated ranch. Jake arrived exactly on time, his boots polished despite their obvious age, his shirt pressed but showing the kind of wear that came from honest work rather than neglect. The conversation lasted 2 hours, during which they covered everything from cattle prices to household chores, from personal histories to expectations for their unusual partnership. Martha learned that Jake had grown up on a small farm in Nebraska, the youngest of 4 boys who'd all left home as soon as they were old enough to find their own way in the world. His parents had died within 6 months of each other when he was 28, and he'd been drifting from job to job ever since, never quite finding a place where he felt like he belonged. Jake discovered that Martha had been born and raised in Cedar Ridge, the daughter of the town's only doctor and a schoolteacher who'd instilled in her a love of learning that had served her well throughout her life. She'd met Frank at a county fair when she was 18, and he was 21, fresh out of agricultural college and full of dreams about expanding his family's small ranch into something that would last for generations. Their courtship had been brief but intense, and they'd married 6 months after their first dance to a fiddle tune played by a traveling band that had set up in the town square. The early years of their marriage had been marked by hard work and modest prosperity, as Frank's careful management and Martha's keen eye for detail helped them weather the inevitable ups and downs of ranch life. But success had made Frank overconfident, and he'd begun taking risks that seemed reasonable at the time but proved disastrous when the market turned against him. A partnership with a cattle broker in Denver had gone south when the man disappeared, with a year's worth of payments. An investment in a new breeding program had failed when a disease swept through the imported stock. A loan secured against the ranch to fund improvements had ballooned beyond their ability to service when interest rates climbed and cattle prices plummeted. Martha had watched their comfortable life erode piece by piece, but she'd never blamed Frank for the decisions they'd made together. Even as creditors began circling and neighbors whispered about foreclosure, she'd stood by her husband and helped him explore every possible solution to their mounting problems. When Frank's health began to fail, she'd taken on more and more of the ranch's daily operations, learning skills that had traditionally been his domain, while continuing to manage the household and care for a man who was slowly disappearing before her eyes. The funeral had been well attended, with ranchers from 3 counties coming to pay their respects to a man who'd been respected despite his financial troubles. But when the last casserole dish had been returned and the sympathy cards stopped arriving, Martha found herself alone with a property that was bleeding money and debts that grew larger every month. She'd spent the first year after Frank's death trying to run the ranch by herself, hiring seasonal help when she could afford it and doing without when she couldn't. But the isolation had been harder to bear than the physical demands of the work, and she'd realized that her options were limited. Sell the ranch to one of the corporate buyers who called every week, or find a partner who could help her keep the operation running. The decision to advertise for a husband had not been made lightly. Martha had wrestled with the idea for months, seeking advice from her pastor and her lawyer while carefully avoiding the gossip mill that would have made her intentions public knowledge before she was ready to act. But as her financial situation grew more desperate and her ability to maintain the property continued to decline, she'd concluded that a marriage of convenience might be her only chance to save the ranch that represented everything she and Frank had worked to build. Jake's arrival in Cedar Ridge had been noticed by everyone within hours of his truck pulling up to the motel on Highway 89. Strangers were rare enough in town that their presence always generated curiosity, and a single man of working age was the subject of immediate speculation. The fact that he'd been seen having coffee with Martha Henderson had set tongues wagging from the beauty shop to the feed store, though most of the talk was more sympathetic than scandalous. The townspeople had watched Martha struggle alone for 8 years, and while they'd offered help when they could, everyone understood that charity could only go so far. If Martha had found someone willing to help her keep the ranch, most folks figured it was nobody's business but her own how she went about it. Jake had spent his first week in town getting to know the property and the local suppliers, introducing himself to the veterinarian and the equipment dealer, and generally making it known that he intended to be around for a while. His quiet competence and straightforward manner had earned him grudging respect from men who were naturally suspicious of outsiders, and his willingness to buy rounds at the Copper Creek had helped break down the initial barriers that always faced newcomers in small communities. The marriage proposal had come at the end of their third meeting, delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone Martha might have used to discuss the weather. Jake had accepted with equal simplicity, asking only that they take a few weeks to get to know each other better before making things official. They'd spent the following days working together on various ranch projects, falling into a comfortable rhythm that suggested their partnership might actually work. Martha was impressed by Jake's knowledge of cattle and his willingness to tackle any job that needed doing, whether it involved fixing fence or mucking out stalls. Jake found himself appreciating Martha's practical approach to problem-solving and her deep understanding of the local conditions that would affect their success. Neither of them spoke of love or even affection, but a mutual respect had developed that seemed like a solid foundation for their unusual arrangement. The wedding ceremony took place on a Friday afternoon in Judge Carmichael's chambers, with his secretary and the court reporter serving as witnesses. Martha wore a simple blue dress that she'd bought especially for the occasion, while Jake had invested in a new shirt and tie to go with his best pair of jeans. The entire proceeding took less than 15 minutes, after which they'd shaken hands with the judge and walked out into the Montana sunshine as husband and wife. The wedding dinner consisted of steaks at Murphy's Diner, where they'd first met to discuss their arrangement. Several locals stopped by their table to offer congratulations, and while the atmosphere was friendly enough, both Jake and Martha could feel the undercurrent of curiosity about their unusual situation. They'd driven back to the ranch in comfortable silence, each lost in thoughts about what their new life together might bring. The Henderson house reflected Martha's practical nature and Frank's love of craftsmanship. Built in the 1960s when the ranch was prospering, it featured solid construction and thoughtful details that had aged well despite minimal maintenance in recent years. The living room centered around a massive stone fireplace that Frank had built himself, using rocks hauled down from the mountains during a particularly harsh winter when there wasn't much else to do. Martha had prepared the guest room for Jake, making it clear that their marriage would be a business arrangement rather than a romantic one. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The room was comfortable enough, with a double bed, a chest of drawers, and a window that looked out over the pasture where the remaining cattle grazed. Jake had appreciated her directness about their sleeping arrangements, as it eliminated any awkwardness about expectations on either side. The first few weeks of married life had passed smoothly enough. They'd established routines that played to their respective strengths, with Jake handling most of the outdoor work, while Martha managed the household and the ranch's financial affairs. They'd eaten their meals together and discussed the day's accomplishments and challenges, but their conversations remained focused on practical matters rather than personal topics. Jake had been careful not to pry into Martha's past or ask questions about Frank that might cause her pain. Martha had shown the same consideration for Jake's privacy, accepting his explanations of his background without pushing for details he seemed reluctant to share. Their relationship had developed along the lines of a successful business partnership, marked by cooperation and mutual respect, rather than the intimacy typically associated with marriage. But Jake had begun to notice small things about Martha that suggested there might be more to her story than she'd revealed. Despite the ranch's obvious financial struggles, she seemed surprisingly knowledgeable about investments and banking procedures. Her comments about cattle markets showed an understanding that went beyond what most ranchers possessed, and she occasionally made references to places and experiences that seemed inconsistent with a life spent entirely in rural Montana. Most intriguing, Martha had developed a habit of disappearing for several hours every few weeks, claiming she needed to run errands in town, but returning without any evidence of shopping or business meetings. Jake had respected her privacy and never asked where she went, but his curiosity had been growing as their marriage entered its second month. The morning that would change everything started like any other. Jake was up before dawn, checking on the cattle in the south pasture while Martha prepared breakfast in the kitchen. The autumn air carried a crisp promise of winter, and the aspen trees on the hillside had turned brilliant gold against the purple mountains. It was the kind of morning that made a man grateful to be alive, even if he couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was about to shift in ways he couldn't predict. Martha had been quieter than usual over the past few days, and Jake had noticed her glancing toward the locked drawer in Frank's old desk more frequently. She'd caught him watching her once, and the look that passed between them had been charged with unspoken questions. But true to their unwritten agreement about privacy, neither had pressed the other for explanations. The knock on the front door came just as they were finishing their morning coffee. Visitors were rare at the Henderson Ranch, especially at 7 in the morning, and both Jake and Martha froze at the sound. Through the window, Jake could see a black sedan with government plates parked in their driveway, and 2 men in dark suits standing on the porch. Martha's face had gone pale, and her hands trembled slightly as she set down her coffee cup. "I'll handle this," she said quietly, but Jake noticed she didn't move toward the door immediately. Instead, she seemed to be gathering herself, as if preparing for a confrontation she'd been dreading for years. The men introduced themselves as Agent Rodriguez and Agent Chen from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They were polite but serious, their credentials genuine, and their interest in Martha Henderson was clearly not casual. Jake stayed in the background, unsure of his role in whatever was unfolding, but ready to support his wife if she needed him. "Mrs. Henderson," Agent Rodriguez began, his voice carefully neutral, "we'd like to ask you some questions about events that occurred in Chicago 30 years ago, specifically about your relationship with Vincent Castellano and the disappearance of certain financial records from his organization." Martha's composure cracked slightly at the mention of Castellano's name, but she recovered quickly. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I've lived in Montana my entire adult life. I've never been involved with anyone named Castellano." Agent Chen opened a manila folder and spread several photographs across the kitchen table. The images showed a much younger woman with dark hair and sophisticated clothing, clearly taken in an urban setting that bore no resemblance to rural Montana. But the woman's face was unmistakably Martha's, despite the decades that had passed and the dramatic change in her appearance. These were taken outside Castellano's restaurant in Chicago in 1993, Chen explained. You were using the name Maria Castaldi at the time, and according to our records, you worked as Vincent Castellano's bookkeeper for approximately 18 months before disappearing, along with several $1 million in cash and bearer bonds. Jake felt the ground shift beneath his feet as he stared at the photographs. The woman in the pictures looked nothing like the Martha he'd married, not just because of her age, but because of her entire bearing. This woman radiated confidence and sophistication, her clothes expensive, her posture that of someone accustomed to moving in circles, far removed from cattle ranches and small-town diners. Martha sank into her chair, her carefully constructed facade finally crumbling. Vincent Castellano has been dead for 25 years, she said quietly. Whatever happened back then, it can't matter now. Actually, it matters quite a lot, Rodriguez replied. Castellano's organization was involved in money laundering, operations that we're still investigating. The funds you took were proceeds from various criminal enterprises, and the statute of limitations hasn't expired on several of the underlying crimes. We need to know where that money is now. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of secrets finally exposed. Jake struggled to process what he was hearing, trying to reconcile the woman he'd married with the sophisticated criminal the agents were describing. Everything about their relationship suddenly took on new meaning. Martha's knowledge of financial markets, her mysterious absences, her ability to maintain the ranch despite its apparent financial difficulties. "How did you find me?" Martha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Chen smiled thinly. "Modern technology is a wonderful thing. Facial recognition software flagged your driver's license photo when it was renewed last year. It took us several months to confirm the match and investigate your current situation, but here we are." Martha looked at Jake for the first time since the agents had arrived, and he could see decades of fear and loneliness in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never meant for you to get involved in this." The agents questioned Martha for over 2 hours, going through the details of her time in Chicago and her relationship with Castellano's organization. Gradually, a picture emerged that was far more complex than Jake had imagined possible. Maria Castaldi had been a 28-year-old certified public accountant from a middle-class Italian family when she'd taken a job with Castellano's legitimate businesses. She'd been intelligent, ambitious, and completely unaware that her new employer was the financial arm of one of Chicago's most powerful crime families. The realization had come slowly, through small inconsistencies in the books and transactions. That didn't quite make sense. By the time Maria understood the true nature of her work, she was already too deeply involved to simply walk away. Castellano had made it clear that people who knew too much about his operations had a tendency to disappear, and Maria had found herself trapped in a world she'd never intended to enter. The opportunity to escape had come during a violent reorganization. Within Castellano's organization, a rival family had made a move against Vincent, and in the chaos that followed, Maria had seen her chance. She'd accessed the emergency cash reserves and bearer bonds that Castellano kept for situations exactly like this, taken what she needed to disappear and vanished into the night. "I didn't steal that money," Martha insisted to the agents. "Vincent owed me 3 years of hazard pay for keeping my mouth shut about his operation. What I took was barely a fraction of what he made from the information I helped him hide from. The IRS, the transformation from Maria Castaldi to Martha Henderson, had been carefully planned and expertly executed. She'd driven straight through to Montana, where she'd used connections in the underground economy to obtain new identification documents. The hair dye had been the first step, turning her distinctive black hair to brown, and then eventually to the silver she wore now. The sophisticated wardrobe had been replaced with practical ranch clothes, and the confident urban professional had gradually become the quiet widow of Cedar Ridge. Meeting Frank Henderson had been pure chance, but it had provided the perfect cover for her new identity. Frank had been recently divorced and lonely, looking for someone to share his life and help him run his expanding ranch operation. Maria had possessed the intelligence and work ethic to be genuinely useful, and their marriage had evolved into something real despite its deceptive beginnings. "Frank never knew?" Jake asked, speaking for the first time since the interrogation had begun. Martha shook her head. "I tried to tell him several times over the years, but the right moment never came. He was such a good man, so honest and straightforward. I was terrified that he'd leave me if he knew the truth about my past." The agents were primarily interested in the location of the money Martha had taken from Castellanos' organization. They'd tracked some of her early financial transactions, but the trail had gone cold after her first year in Montana. Martha had been careful to avoid any activities that might attract federal attention, living modestly and keeping her stolen nest egg well hidden. "The money is safe," Martha told them. "I've never touched more than I absolutely needed to survive. Most of it is exactly where I put it 30 years ago." Rodriguez leaned forward. "We're going to need you to show us where that is, Mrs. Henderson. This is a federal investigation, and we have the authority to search this property with or without your cooperation." Martha glanced at Jake again, and he could see her making a decision that would affect both of their futures. "It's not on the property," she said finally, "and I'll show you where it is. But I want immunity from prosecution in exchange for my cooperation." The negotiation that followed lasted another hour, with the agents making phone calls to their superiors and Martha consulting with a lawyer she contacted from the phone book. In the end, they reached an agreement that would allow Martha to avoid prison in exchange for returning the stolen funds and providing information about Castellanos' operation that might help with ongoing investigations. As the agents prepared to leave, Rodriguez handed Martha a business card. "We'll be back tomorrow morning with the paperwork. Don't even think about disappearing again, Mrs. Henderson. We'll be watching." After the sedan pulled out of the driveway, Jake and Martha sat in their kitchen in stunned silence. The morning sun streamed through the windows, but the warmth it should have brought was overshadowed by the cold reality of what had just been revealed. "I understand if you want me to leave," Martha said eventually. "This isn't what you signed up for when you answered my advertisement." Jake studied his wife's face, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time since they'd met. The fear was still there, but also a kind of relief, as if a burden she'd carried for 3 decades was finally being lifted from her shoulders. "Where is it?" he asked simply. Martha looked puzzled. "Where is what?" "The money. You said it wasn't on the property, so where did you hide it?" A ghost of a smile crossed Martha's face. "You remember the old mine shaft up in the hills behind the North Pasture? The one that's been boarded up since the 1950s? Jake nodded. He'd noticed the weathered boards and posted warnings during his exploration of the ranch, but he'd assumed it was just another abandoned mining operation from Montana's mineral boom days. "Frank and I used to hike up there sometimes in the early years of our marriage. He showed me how the miners had carved out storage chambers in the rock, places where they could cache supplies during the winter months. One of those chambers has been serving as my bank for the past 30 years. The revelation explained so much about Martha's behavior over the years. Her mysterious absences weren't trips to town, but carefully planned visits to her hidden treasure. The knowledge she'd displayed about financial markets came from years of watching her stolen nest egg grow through careful investments made under false names. "How much?" Jake asked. "Close to $8 million now," Martha replied. Castellanos, original 3.2 million, plus 30 years of compound interest from conservative investments. I've been very careful to only touch the interest, never the principal. Jake whistled softly. He'd been worrying about keeping the ranch afloat with a few $1,000s in the bank, while his wife had been sitting on a fortune that could buy a dozen similar properties. Why didn't you use it to save the ranch after Frank died? He asked. You could have paid off all the debts and still had millions left over. Martha's expression grew sad. Because it was never really mine. I always knew that someday someone would come looking for it, and I wanted to be able to give it back. Using stolen money to save Frank's ranch would have tainted everything he worked to build. The afternoon passed in a strange haze of normalcy, disrupted by earth-shaking revelations. They went through the motions of their usual routine, checking cattle, repairing fence, preparing dinner, but every mundane task was overshadowed by the knowledge that their life together was about to change dramatically. That evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Martha began to tell Jake the stories she'd never shared with anyone. She spoke of her childhood in Chicago, growing up in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's business, but nobody talked about what the men in expensive suits actually did for a living. She described her early career ambitions, the pride she'd felt at landing a prestigious accounting job, and the gradual horror of discovering that her professional skills were being used to facilitate crimes she'd never imagined. She talked about the fear that had consumed her daily life during those final months in Chicago, knowing too much to be safe, but not knowing how to escape. Most poignantly, she spoke about Frank and the guilt she'd carried throughout their marriage. She genuinely loved him, but their entire relationship had been built on a foundation of lies she'd been too frightened to reveal. The money hidden in the mine had been like a sword, hanging over their happiness, always present but never acknowledged. He deserved better than that, Martha said, tears streaming down her face. He deserved a wife who could be completely honest. With him, Jake reached over and took her hand. Maybe, he said quietly. But he also deserved someone who loved him enough to sacrifice her own peace of mind to keep him safe. Frank may not have known your secrets, but he knew your character. That's what he fell in love with, not your past. As the stars began to appear in the Montana sky, Martha made a decision that had been building for 30 years. Tomorrow, she would take the FBI agents to the mine and turn over every dollar she'd taken from Vincent Castellanos' organization. She would answer their questions about the Chicago operation and provide whatever information might help them close the book on crimes committed before Jake had even met her. But tonight, for the first time in 3 decades, she was going to be completely honest with someone she cared about. She was going to tell Jake everything, not just about the money, but about the woman she'd been before fear had driven her to recreate herself in the wilds of Montana. The conversation lasted until, well past midnight, covering ground that neither of them had expected to traverse when they'd agreed to their marriage of convenience. By the time they said goodnight and went to their separate rooms, something fundamental had shifted between them. Jake lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to process everything he'd learned. The woman he'd married was not the person he'd thought she was, but somehow that made her more interesting rather than less trustworthy. Martha's secrets hadn't been kept out of malice or greed, but out of a desire to protect the people she cared about from the consequences of her past mistakes. In the master bedroom, Martha was experiencing something she hadn't felt in 30 years, the peace that comes from having no secrets left to hide. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for the first time since she'd fled Chicago, she wasn't facing them alone. The sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the early morning air announced that the FBI was taking Martha's revelation seriously. Jake stepped out onto the porch to see not just the black sedan from the day before, but also a white van marked with federal insignia and a helicopter circling the ranch like a mechanical vulture. Whatever Martha had hidden in that mine shaft was important enough to warrant a full investigative team. Agent Rodriguez emerged from the sedan with a thick folder of legal documents, while Agent Chen coordinated with the technical specialists who were unloading equipment from the van. Martha had spent the night in a state of nervous exhaustion, alternating between relief at finally unburdening herself and terror at what the consequences might be. "The immunity agreement has been approved," Rodriguez informed them as he spread the paperwork across the kitchen table. "In exchange for your full cooperation and the return of all funds taken from the Castellano organization, you'll receive immunity from prosecution for crimes committed during your time in Chicago. However, any attempt to conceal additional assets or provide false information will void this agreement immediately." Martha signed the documents with hands that shook slightly, her signature looking fragile compared to the bold stroke she'd used as Maria Castaldi 30 years earlier. Jake watched from across the kitchen, still struggling to reconcile the frightened woman before him with the confident criminal mastermind the FBI seemed to believe she'd been. The hike to the mine shaft took the better part of an hour, with the federal team hauling detection equipment and cameras up the rocky trail that wound through the pine forest behind the ranch. Martha led the way with the sure-footed confidence of someone who'd made this journey dozens of times over the years, while Jake brought up the rear, keeping an eye on the agents who were documenting everything with military precision. The abandoned Copper Queen mine had been sealed with heavy wooden planks and warning signs when the last miners gave up their claims in 1954. But Martha had discovered years earlier that one section of the barrier could be removed by someone who knew exactly which boards to lift. She'd been careful to make her modifications invisible to casual observers, ensuring that her secret bank would remain undisturbed. Agent Chen filmed everything as Martha demonstrated how to access the hidden entrance, sliding between the weathered boards into the dark tunnel beyond. The mine shaft extended about 50 feet into the hillside before opening into a natural cavern that the original miners had expanded for storage purposes. Martha had brought battery-powered lanterns on her previous visits, but the FBI team was equipped with professional lighting that illuminated the chamber in harsh detail. The walls showed tool marks from long-dead miners, and the air carried the mineral scent of deep earth mixed with decades of accumulated dust. In the far corner of the chamber, covered by a tarp that had somehow remained waterproof through 3 decades of seasonal temperature changes, Martha's cache waited exactly as she'd left it. The tarp covered a collection of military surplus ammunition boxes, their metal surfaces still bearing stenciled numbers from some forgotten government arsenal. "There are 12 boxes in total," Martha explained, as Agent Rodriguez began photographing the setup. 6 contained cash in various denominations, 4 hold-bearer bonds and investment certificates, and 2 have gold coins that I acquired gradually over the years to hedge against inflation. The process of cataloging and removing the hidden treasure took most of the day. Each box was opened, inventoried and photographed before being carefully transported down the mountain to the waiting vehicles. The cash alone filled 3 large evidence bags, bundled hundreds and thousands that had remained crisp and clean in their climate-controlled hiding place. The bearer bonds were more problematic, representing investments Martha had made using false identities over the years. Some had matured and been rolled over into new certificates, while others had grown in value as the companies they represented prospered. Agent Chen spent considerable time on his satellite phone, coordinating with financial specialists who would be needed to unravel the complex web of investments Martha had created. The gold coins were perhaps the most revealing aspect of Martha's financial strategy. Rather than simply hoarding Castellano's stolen cash, she demonstrated sophisticated understanding of asset preservation and portfolio diversification. The coins ranged from American eagles to South African Krugerrands, purchased gradually, through dealers who specialized in privacy-conscious transactions. "You've been busy," Agent Rodriguez observed as they tallied the final inventory. "This represents considerably more money than Castellano's organization reported as missing." Martha nodded. "I told you I was careful. The original 3.2 million has been growing for 30 years through conservative investments. I never touched the principal, only used small amounts of the interest when Frank's medical bills became overwhelming." Jake learned more about his wife's hidden life during that long day than he'd discovered in all their previous conversations combined. As the FBI team worked to secure and document Martha's cash, she explained the intricate system she'd developed to manage her stolen fortune without attracting attention. She'd used multiple false identities to make investments, never keeping more than a few $100,000 with any single institution. The identities themselves were works of art, complete with credit histories and employment records that could withstand casual investigation. Martha had become an expert at living multiple lives simultaneously, keeping each identity separate and secure. The most impressive aspect of her financial management was the electronic component. Martha had embraced online banking and investment platforms years before most people her age, using encrypted communications and virtual private networks to manage her portfolio from the isolation of the ranch. The computer in Frank's old office, which Jake had assumed was used primarily for ranch record-keeping, was actually the control center for a sophisticated financial operation. "How did you learn all this?" Jake asked as they watched the agents load the final evidence bag into their van. "Necessity," Martha replied. "When you're sitting on millions of dollars in stolen money, you become very motivated to understand how money actually works. I spent years reading financial publications, studying investment strategies, and learning about asset protection techniques. It became a kind of obsession." The revelation of Martha's hidden fortune had immediate practical implications for their ranch operation. With the cash now in federal custody, Martha had to find legitimate ways to access funds for daily expenses. Fortunately, her years of careful financial planning had included setting aside clean money for exactly this situation. She had legitimate bank accounts under her Martha Henderson identity, funded gradually over the years with small amounts of investment income that could be explained as returns on Frank's modest savings. These accounts wouldn't make them wealthy, but they contained enough money to keep the ranch operational while Martha's legal situation was resolved. The FBI team departed late in the afternoon, leaving behind a silence that felt different from the comfortable quiet Jake and Martha had shared before. They were alone together again, but everything had changed. The woman sitting across from him at dinner was no longer the struggling widow he'd married, but someone far more complex and potentially dangerous. "What happens now?" Jake asked as they cleared the dinner dishes. "The federal prosecutors will review my case and decide whether to pursue charges related to crimes I might have committed while working for Castellano," Martha explained. "The immunity agreement protects me from prosecution for taking the money, but it doesn't cover other activities they might uncover during their investigation." Jake was beginning to understand that Martha's situation was more complicated than simple theft. Her 18 months working for Castellano's organization had involved activities that could be interpreted as money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The statute of limitations had expired on some potential charges, but others remained viable if prosecutors decided to pursue them. The waiting period that followed was unlike anything either of them had experienced. Federal agents made regular visits to the ranch, following up on details from Martha's testimony and pursuing leads that emerged from their investigation of her financial records. Each visit brought the possibility that Martha might be arrested and taken away, leaving Jake alone with a ranch operation he wasn't sure he could manage by himself. During this uncertain time, Jake began to see aspects of Martha's personality that had been hidden beneath her carefully maintained facade. The woman who'd been cautious to the point of paranoia about revealing personal information became almost recklessly open about her past. She seemed to find relief in finally being able to discuss the experiences that had shaped her adult life. Martha told Jake about the fear that had dominated her existence during those final months in Chicago, when Vincent Castellano had become increasingly paranoid about potential informants within his organization. She described the violence she'd witnessed, the casual brutality that was simply another cost of doing business for men like Castellano. Most disturbing were her accounts of the gradual moral compromise that had characterized her time with the organization. She'd started as an honest accountant who'd stumbled into a criminal enterprise, but she'd eventually become an active participant in money laundering schemes that helped fund activities ranging from illegal gambling to loan sharking. I told myself I was trapped, Martha confessed during one of their late-night conversations. But the truth is, I stayed longer than I had to because the money was incredible. Vincent paid me more in 6 months than I could have made in 5 years at a legitimate accounting firm. The confession helped Jake understand why Martha had been so careful about using her stolen fortune. The money represented not just financial security, but also the tangible reminder of choices she'd made that still caused her shame. Giving it back to the federal government was as much about personal redemption as it was about avoiding prosecution. 3 weeks after the mine shaft excavation, Agent Rodriguez returned with news that would determine Martha's future. The federal prosecutors had completed their review of her case and reached a decision about whether to pursue additional charges. "The good news is that you're not going to prison," Rodriguez announced as he took his familiar seat at their kitchen table. "The immunity agreement will be honored, and we're not pursuing charges for your activities with the Castellano organization." Martha's relief was visible, but Jake noticed she wasn't celebrating yet. "What's the bad news?" she asked. "The IRS has some questions about your tax filings over the past 30 years, Rodriguez continued. "They're particularly interested in the investment income you failed to report and the false identities you used to evade tax obligations. Tax evasion has its own statute of limitations, and some of your activities fall within the actionable timeframe." The tax implications of Martha's hidden financial empire were staggering. 30 years of unreported investment income, combined with penalties and interest, created a potential liability that could easily exceed the value of the ranch. Martha had been so focused on hiding from criminal prosecution that she'd overlooked the civil consequences of her financial activities. "How much are we talking about?" Jake asked, though he dreaded the answer. Rodriguez consulted his notes. "Preliminary calculations suggest somewhere between $2 and $3 million in back. Taxes, penalties, and interest. The exact amount will depend on negotiations between your attorney and the IRS." The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Martha had successfully hidden $8 million from federal investigators for 3 decades, only to discover that the government's civil enforcement powers were more threatening than their criminal prosecution capabilities. She could avoid prison, but she might lose everything she and Frank had built together. That evening, Martha made another decision that surprised Jake with its implications. Rather than fight the IRS assessment or attempt to negotiate a reduced settlement, she announced her intention to pay whatever amount the government demanded, using the clean money she'd accumulated through legitimate investments. "I have about $4 million in various accounts that can be documented as legitimate income," she explained. It's money I earned through careful investing of Frank's savings and my own earnings over the years. The IRS can have all of it if necessary. Jake was beginning to understand that Martha's relationship with money was fundamentally different from most people's. She'd lived with the psychological burden of stolen wealth for so long that paying it back, even at great personal cost, represented a form of liberation that was worth more than financial security. The practical implications of Martha's decision would reshape their entire future. Without her hidden fortune to fall back on, they would be genuinely dependent on the ranch operation for their livelihood. The property that Jake had assumed was failing might actually be their only viable source of income, but Martha had one more surprise in store. As they prepared for bed that night, she led Jake to Frank's old office and opened the locked drawer that had captured his attention so many times. Inside was a leather portfolio containing documents that would change his understanding of their situation once again. Frank wasn't quite the simple rancher everyone thought he was, Martha said, as she spread the papers across the desk. He may not have known about my past, but he had some secrets of his own. The documents Frank had kept locked away revealed a side of him that even Martha had never suspected. Spread across the desk were mineral rights deeds, geological surveys, and correspondence with mining companies that painted a picture of a man who'd been quietly positioning himself for a windfall that never came during his lifetime. Jake studied the papers by lamplight, while Martha provided context for discoveries that were reshaping her understanding of her first marriage. Frank hadn't been the simple cattle rancher he'd appeared to be. He'd been a shrewd businessman who'd recognized that the land beneath his pastures might be worth more than the cattle grazing above it. He started acquiring mineral rights in the 1980s, Martha explained, pointing to a series of deed transfers that showed Frank gradually purchasing subsurface rights from neighboring ranchers. Most of them were happy to sell for a few $1,000s, thinking the mining era in this area was over permanently. The geological surveys told a different story. Frank had commissioned private studies that identified significant copper and molybdenum deposits beneath a 10-square-mile area that included not just the Henderson Ranch, but also portions of 5 neighboring properties. The surveys suggested that modern extraction techniques could make mining operations profitable, even with lower-grade ore than had been economically viable in the 1950s. Why didn't he ever develop these claims? Jake asked, noting that some of the surveys were less than 5 years old. Martha shook her head. I think he was waiting for the right opportunity, or maybe the right partner. Some of these correspondence files show he was in negotiations with Consolidated Mining Corporation right up until his health started failing. The revelation of Frank's mineral rights empire explained several mysteries that had puzzled Jake since his arrival at the ranch. The property was larger than necessary for cattle ranching, and Frank had made some improvements that seemed excessive for a struggling operation. He'd also maintained relationships with geological consultants and mining engineers that had struck neighbors as odd for a cattle rancher. Most significantly, Frank's mineral rights strategy explained why Martha had been so determined to keep the ranch in the family despite its apparent financial difficulties. The land itself might be struggling to support a cattle operation, but the mineral wealth beneath it represented a potential fortune that could dwarf even Martha's stolen nest egg. "Do you think Frank knew about your past?" Jake asked as they organized the papers into coherent files. "I don't think so," Martha replied, though she sounded less certain than before. "But these documents suggest he was much more sophisticated about financial planning than I gave him credit for. Maybe he suspected I had resources I wasn't discussing." The timing of Frank's mineral rights acquisitions was particularly intriguing. He'd begun purchasing subsurface claims shortly after marrying Martha, using financing that his ranch income alone couldn't have supported. The down payments and legal fees for the various transactions would have required access to capital that should have been beyond his means as a struggling rancher. Jake began to wonder if Frank had somehow discovered Martha's hidden wealth and used that knowledge to fund his mineral rights strategy, without ever directly confronting her about her secrets. It would explain how he'd managed to expand his holdings. During years when the ranch was supposedly losing money, the correspondence files revealed that Frank had been much closer to developing his mineral claims than anyone had realized. Consolidated Mining Corporation had conducted extensive feasibility studies and was prepared to offer a partnership agreement that would have generated millions of dollars in annual royalties for the Henderson Ranch. The negotiations were suspended. When Frank's health declined, Martha read from a letter dated just 6 months before his death. But according to this, Consolidated was still interested in resuming discussions with his heirs after an appropriate period of mourning. Jake felt a chill as the implication sank in. If Consolidated Mining was still interested in developing Frank's mineral claims, then Martha's legal troubles with the FBI might be the least of their concerns. Mining companies didn't abandon multi-million-dollar projects lightly, and they had the resources to pursue their interests aggressively. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor who confirmed Jake's worst fears. David Thornton arrived in a silver Mercedes that looked distinctly out of place in the ranch's gravel driveway. His business card identified him as Senior Vice President for Land Acquisition at Consolidated Mining Corporation, and his presence suggested that Frank's mineral rights had attracted attention from people who weren't easily discouraged. Thornton was smooth, professional, and completely informed about both Frank's mineral holdings and Martha's recent legal difficulties. He'd clearly been monitoring the situation, waiting for the right moment to approach Martha about resuming the negotiations that had been interrupted by Frank's death. "I want to be completely transparent with you, Mrs. Henderson," Thornton began, as he spread his own set of documents across their kitchen table. "Consolidated has invested considerable resources in surveying this area, and we're prepared to move forward with or without your participation." The threat was politely delivered but unmistakable. Thornton's company had identified ways to access the mineral deposits beneath the Henderson Ranch through claims on adjacent properties. They preferred to have Martha as a partner, but they were prepared to proceed as competitors if necessary. "Frank's mineral rights give you significant leverage in these negotiations," Thornton continued. "But only if you're in a position to develop them independently or partner with a company that has the necessary resources. If you're forced to sell the ranch to cover your tax obligations, those rights become much less valuable." Jake realized they were being offered a choice between cooperation and financial destruction. Consolidated Mining had clearly done their homework about Martha's legal situation and was using that knowledge to pressure her into accepting terms that heavily favored the mining company. The partnership agreement Thornton presented was complex, but its essential terms were straightforward. Consolidated would pay Martha a signing bonus of $5 million in exchange for exclusive development rights to the mineral deposits beneath her property. Annual royalty payments would provide additional income if the mining operation proved profitable. The signing bonus alone would cover your estimated tax obligations, Thornton pointed out, and the royalty structure would provide steady income for the rest of your life. You could keep the ranch, pay off your debts, and still have money left over for improvements and expansion. Martha studied the contract with the careful attention of someone who'd spent years reviewing complex financial documents. Jake could see her calculating not just the immediate benefits, but also the long-term implications of partnering with a major corporation. "What about environmental impact?" Martha asked. "This ranch has been in Frank's family for 3 generations. I'm not going to be the one who destroys it for short-term profit." Thornton was prepared for environmental concerns, He produced additional documents showing that modern mining techniques could extract valuable minerals with minimal surface disruption. The proposed operation would use underground mining methods that would preserve the ranch's grazing land and water resources. "We're talking about surgical extraction, not strip mining," Thornton explained. "The surface facilities would occupy less than 50 acres, and most of the ranch would continue to function normally. You could maintain your cattle operation while earning substantial income from mineral extraction." The offer was tempting, but Jake sensed there were aspects of the deal that Thornton wasn't fully explaining. Mining operations, even with modern techniques, created risks that could affect the entire property. Water contamination, ground subsidence, and air quality issues were all potential problems that could make the ranch uninhabitable regardless of the financial benefits. "We need time to consider this," Martha told Thornton, "and we'll want our own attorney to review the contract before making any decisions." Thornton nodded, but his expression suggested he wasn't accustomed to having his offers subjected to extended deliberation. "Of course, but I should mention that this offer has a time limit. Market conditions and regulatory requirements change quickly in the mining industry. We can't hold this proposal open indefinitely." After Thornton left, Jake and Martha spent the afternoon walking the ranch boundaries, looking at their land with new eyes. Every pasture and creek bed took on different significance when viewed as potential mining territory. The peaceful isolation they'd both valued was about to be shattered by industrial development, regardless of whether they participated willingly. That evening, Martha made a phone call that surprised Jake with its implications. Instead of contacting a lawyer to review Consolidated's contract, she called her former attorney in Chicago, a man named Samuel Rodriguez, who'd helped her establish her new identity 30 years earlier. "Sam has experience with complex financial transactions involving questionable legal circumstances," Martha explained after ending the call. "He'll know how to protect our interests while navigating the tax implications and potential criminal exposure." Jake was beginning to understand that Martha's past connections extended far beyond her relationship with Vincent Castellano. She'd built a network of professionals who specialized in helping people with complicated legal situations, and she was prepared to use those resources to protect their future. Rodriguez arrived 2 days later, flying into Billings and driving to the ranch in a rental car that looked as out of place as Thornton's Mercedes had been. But where Thornton had been slick and corporate, Rodriguez was rumpled and intense. A man who'd spent decades helping clients navigate the gray areas between legal and illegal activities. "Your situation is more complex than a simple mining contract," Rodriguez told them after reviewing both Consolidated's offer and the FBI's immunity agreement. "The mineral rights Frank acquired create assets that could be subject to federal seizure if the government decides you use stolen money to help finance their acquisition." The possibility hadn't occurred to either Jake or Martha, but Rodriguez's concern was well-founded. If federal investigators concluded that Martha's hidden wealth had somehow subsidized Frank's mineral rights strategy, those rights could be confiscated as proceeds of criminal activity. "However," Rodriguez continued, "the immunity agreement specifically protects assets that can be documented as legitimate acquisitions made with clean money. If we can prove that Frank's mineral rights were purchased entirely with funds that had no connection to your Chicago activities, they should be safe from federal seizure." The process of documenting Frank's financing proved more challenging than expected. His records were meticulous, but they showed a pattern of cash transactions and private loans that would be difficult to verify 3 decades later. Some of the mineral rights had been purchased from elderly ranchers who were no longer alive, and their heirs had incomplete records of the original transactions. Rodriguez spent a week reconstructing Frank's financial history. interviewing bank officials and tracking down documents that proved the legitimacy of his mineral rights acquisitions. The investigation revealed that Frank had been far more sophisticated about business and finance than his neighbors had realized. "Your first husband was running a classic wealth-building strategy," Rodriguez explained to Martha. "He was using the ranch's modest but steady cash flow to leverage investments in undervalued assets. The mineral rights were just one component of a larger portfolio that included timber rights, water rights, and agricultural leases. The revelation that Frank had been building a hidden empire of natural resource rights parallel to Martha's hidden financial empire was almost too coincidental to believe. Two people with major secrets had somehow found each other and built a marriage that worked despite the fundamental deceptions involved." "Do you think he knew about my money?" Martha asked Rodriguez. "I think you both knew the other had secrets," Rodriguez replied. "But you were each so focused on protecting your own secrets that you never forced a confrontation about what the other was hiding." Rodriguez's investigation also revealed why Frank had been so accepting of Martha's occasional absences and mysterious errands. He'd been making his own secretive trips to meet with geological consultants, mining engineers, and potential business partners. Their marriage had been built on mutual respect for each other's privacy, even when that privacy concealed major deceptions. The legal strategy Rodriguez developed was designed to protect both Martha's interests and the mineral rights Frank had accumulated. Rather than simply accepting Consolidated's partnership offer, he proposed creating a competitive bidding process that would force multiple mining companies to compete for development rights. "Frank's mineral holdings are more valuable than Consolidated wants you to believe," Rodriguez explained. "The surveys they've conducted show deposits that could support mining operations for decades. Other companies would be interested if they knew these rights were available." The bidding process would also provide additional legal protection by demonstrating that Martha was acting as a legitimate businesswoman rather than someone trying to hide assets from federal investigators. Public auctions and competitive bidding created documentation that would satisfy both the IRS and the FBI about the legitimacy of any proceeds. But Rodriguez's most important contribution was his analysis of the tax implications surrounding Martha's situation. Rather than simply paying whatever the IRS demanded, he proposed a settlement strategy that would minimize her liability while satisfying the government's requirements for recovering unpaid taxes. "The key is demonstrating that you're cooperating fully with federal authorities while protecting your legitimate business interests," Rodriguez explained. "The mineral rights represent a separate asset class that predates your legal troubles. If we handle this correctly, you should be able to satisfy your tax obligations without sacrificing Frank's legacy." As Part 4 concluded, Jake found himself married to a woman whose life was far more complex than he'd ever imagined, sitting on mineral rights worth millions of dollars, and facing decisions that would determine whether they could build a future together, or whether external forces would tear apart everything they'd worked to create. The competitive bidding process Rodriguez orchestrated attracted attention from mining companies across the western United States. Within 2 weeks of announcing the availability of Frank's mineral rights, representatives from 6 major corporations had requested site visits and geological data. The Henderson Ranch, which had been quietly isolated for decades, suddenly became the center of an industrial gold rush. Jake found himself playing tour guide to teams of engineers and geologists who tramped across the property with sophisticated detection equipment, mapping underground formations that had remained hidden since the last ice age. The contrast between their high-tech approach and the traditional ranching methods he'd grown accustomed to was stark enough to make him feel like he was living in 2 different centuries simultaneously. Martha watched the proceedings with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. Each company's presentation revealed new aspects of the mineral wealth Frank had identified, but also highlighted the environmental risks that large-scale extraction would bring to their land. The ranch that had been her refuge for 30 years was about to be transformed into something completely different. The second company to visit was Apex Extraction, a Colorado-based firm that specialized in environmentally conscious mining operations. Their representative, Dr. Sarah Chen, impressed both Jake and Martha with her detailed knowledge of sustainable extraction techniques and her genuine concern for preserving the ranch's agricultural value. "We're not interested in strip mining or operations that would destroy your surface land," Dr. Chen explained, as she pointed to topographical maps showing proposed underground tunnels. "Our approach involves accessing the ore deposits through a series of small-diameter shafts that would have minimal impact on your grazing areas." Apex's proposal included provisions for ongoing ranching operations, with the company taking responsibility for maintaining water quality and soil integrity throughout the mining process. They offered a higher percentage of royalties than Consolidated, along with guaranteed annual minimum payments that would provide financial security regardless of mineral extraction rates. "The technology exists to do this right," Dr. Chen continued. "The question is whether you're willing to work with a company that prioritizes long-term sustainability over short-term profits." The third company, Western Resource Development, took a completely different approach. Their representative, James Mitchell, arrived with a proposal to purchase the mineral rights outright for $25 million, eliminating the need for ongoing partnerships or royalty arrangements. "Cash transactions simplify everything," Mitchell argued. "No environmental liability, no operational oversight, no dependence on commodity prices or extraction rates. You get your money up front, and we assume all the risks associated with development." The outright purchase option was tempting, especially given Martha's ongoing legal complications. A lump sum payment would allow them to settle with the IRS immediately and provide enough capital to invest in ranch improvements or alternative business ventures. But it also meant giving up control over how the mineral wealth was extracted and losing the potential for long-term income. Rodriguez advised caution about any deal that seemed too good to be true. His investigation of Western Resource Development revealed connections to overseas investment funds and a track record of aggressive extraction methods that had left other properties environmentally damaged. Companies that offer huge upfront payments usually do so because they plan to extract maximum value as quickly as possible, Rodriguez warned. They're not interested in sustainable operations or preserving surface land use. The fourth company to visit brought an entirely different perspective to the bidding process. Native Earth Mining was a consortium of tribal enterprises and environmental organizations that specialized in resource extraction projects designed to benefit local communities rather than distant shareholders. Their representative, Thomas Blackhorse, was a geologist and member of the Crow Nation who'd grown up on a reservation less than 100 miles from the Henderson Ranch. His proposal emphasized community partnership, environmental stewardship, and respect for the cultural significance of the land. "Mining doesn't have to be destructive," Blackhorse explained. "Our approach involves working with the land rather than against it, using techniques that honor both the economic value of mineral resources and the ecological systems that support life above ground." Native Earth's financial offer was competitive, but their most compelling feature was a governance structure that would give Martha and Jake significant input into operational decisions. Rather than simply collecting royalty checks, they would participate in ongoing management of the extraction process. The cultural perspective Blackhorse brought to the discussion resonated with Martha in ways she hadn't expected. His emphasis on long-term stewardship and community benefit, reminded her of the values that had originally drawn her to rural Montana as a refuge from the predatory capitalism she'd experienced in Chicago. Jake found himself impressed by Native Earth's track record of successful partnerships with ranching families throughout the region. Their operations had consistently maintained agricultural productivity while generating substantial income from mineral extraction, proving that the two land uses could coexist successfully. But the most surprising development in the bidding process came from an unexpected source. Frank's nephew, Robert Henderson, arrived from Seattle with a proposal that nobody had anticipated. As Frank's only surviving heir, Robert claimed legal standing to challenge any mining agreements that didn't include his participation. Uncle Frank never mentioned mineral rights in his will, Robert argued. But family mining claims dating back to the 1890s give me legitimate interests in any subsurface development on this property. Robert's appearance complicated an already complex situation. Rodriguez's investigation revealed that the Henderson family had indeed held mining claims in the area during the late 19th century, though those claims had been assumed to be abandoned decades earlier. If Robert could prove continuous family ownership of mineral rights, he might be entitled to a significant portion of any mining proceeds. The legal challenge forced a temporary halt to the bidding process while Rodriguez researched the historical mining claims and their potential impact on Frank's more recent acquisitions. The delay frustrated the mining companies, but it also provided Jake and Martha with additional time to consider their options without pressure from aggressive negotiations. During the hiatus, Martha made a decision that surprised everyone involved in the process. Rather than waiting for the legal issues to be resolved, she announced her intention to visit each of the mining operations the competing companies had established in other locations. She wanted to see firsthand what their partnership would mean for the ranch. The inspection tour took 2 weeks and covered mining sites across Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado. Jake accompanied Martha, serving as both companion and advisor as they evaluated different approaches to mineral extraction. The trip provided education they couldn't have gained from presentations and proposals alone. Consolidated Mining's operation in Wyoming was impressive in its scale and efficiency, but also sobering in its environmental impact. Despite assurances about minimal surface disruption, the facility occupied several hundred acres and generated enough noise and dust to affect wildlife patterns for miles around. Apex Extraction's Colorado site offered a stark contrast. Their underground operation was nearly invisible from the surface, with access points disguised to blend with the natural landscape. The ranching family that had partnered with Apex continued to graze cattle and grow hay on the same land where intensive mining was taking place below ground. The key is planning, Dr. Chen explained, as she guided them through the underground facility. When you design the extraction process to work with existing land use rather than replacing it, everyone benefits. Native Earth's operation on the Crow Reservation provided the most compelling example of community-centered mining. The project had funded schools, healthcare facilities, and infrastructure improvements that benefited the entire region. The mining income had been reinvested in ways that strengthened local communities rather than enriching distant shareholders. The inspection tour also revealed the long-term implications of different partnership structures. Companies that offered higher upfront payments often delivered lower ongoing returns, while those emphasizing sustainable operations provided steadier income over extended periods. By the time they returned to the ranch, Martha had reached conclusions that would surprise both the mining companies and the federal agents still monitoring her legal situation. Rather than accepting the highest financial offer, she was leaning toward the partnership that would provide the most control over how their land was developed. The decision-making process was further complicated by new developments in Martha's tax case. The IRS had completed their audit of her financial records and issued a final assessment that was lower than originally feared, but still substantial enough to require careful financial planning. They're demanding $2.4 million in back taxes, penalties and interest, Rodriguez reported. The good news is that we can negotiate a payment plan that spreads the liability over several years. The bad news is that any mining income will be subject to immediate garnishment until the debt is satisfied. The tax lien created additional urgency around the mining negotiations. Martha needed to generate significant income quickly, but she also had to ensure that any partnership would provide enough long-term revenue to justify the environmental and social costs of mineral extraction. Robert Henderson's legal challenge was resolved through negotiations that satisfied his claims while preserving Martha's primary interests. Rather than fighting over historical mining rights, they agreed to make Robert a minority partner in any future mining operations, giving him a financial stake without control over operational decisions. The resolution of the family dispute cleared the way for final negotiations with the mining companies. Rodriguez had used the delay to develop a sophisticated evaluation framework that considered not just financial returns, but also environmental impact, community benefit, and long-term sustainability. Martha's final decision reflected priorities that had evolved significantly since the process began. Rather than maximizing short-term income, she chose Native Earth Mining as their partner, accepting slightly lower financial returns in exchange for greater control over how their land would be developed. The partnership agreement with Native Earth included provisions that addressed every concern Martha and Jake had raised during the negotiation process. Environmental protection standards exceeded federal requirements. Community benefit provisions ensured that local residents would share in the mining income, and operational oversight gave Martha veto power over any activities that might damage the ranch's agricultural value. The signing ceremony took place at the ranch on a clear October morning when the aspen trees had turned gold and the mountains provided a dramatic backdrop for the historic agreement. Representatives from Native Earth, federal regulators, and local government officials gathered to witness the beginning of a new chapter in the Henderson Ranch's history. Thomas Blackhorse signed the documents with a fountain pen that had belonged to his grandfather, a gesture that emphasized the cultural significance of the partnership. Martha used the same pen Frank had used to sign their marriage certificate 32 years earlier, connecting the mining agreement to the legacy of their life together. The financial terms of the partnership would provide Martha with enough income to satisfy her tax obligations while maintaining the ranch as a working cattle operation. The signing bonus alone was sufficient to pay off the IRS assessment, and annual royalty payments would ensure long-term financial security. But the most significant aspect of the partnership was its potential to transform the entire region. Native Earth's commitment to community benefit meant that mining income would fund infrastructure improvements, educational programs, and economic development initiatives that would benefit all residents of Cedar Ridge and the surrounding area. Jake found himself appointed as ranch liaison to the mining operation, a position that would allow him to oversee day-to-day coordination between agricultural and extractive activities. The role represented a dramatic evolution from his original job as Martha's hired hand, but it also provided exactly the kind of stable, meaningful work he'd been seeking throughout his wandering years. As the ceremony concluded and the various officials departed, Jake and Martha stood on their porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. The ranch that had brought them together under such unusual circumstances was about to become something neither of them had imagined. when they'd first shaken hands over coffee at Murphy's diner. "Do you think Frank would approve?" Martha asked, gesturing toward the signed agreements that would soon transform their quiet cattle operation into a major mining partnership. Jake considered the question seriously. Frank Henderson had been a man who valued both tradition and progress, someone who'd built his success by recognizing opportunities that others had missed. The mineral rights strategy he'd developed suggested he'd always intended for the ranch to evolve beyond simple cattle ranching. "I think he'd be proud that you found a way to honor his vision while staying true to your own values," Jake replied. "He spent years positioning the ranch for this opportunity. You've made sure it benefits the community he loved instead of just enriching distant corporations. The transformation ahead would bring challenges neither of them could fully anticipate, but it would also provide the financial security and community connection they'd both been seeking in their different ways." Martha's long journey from Chicago, criminal to Montana rancher, was about to enter a new phase that would finally allow her to build something positive from the wealth that had burdened her for 3 decades. The first year of the mining partnership brought changes to the Henderson ranch that transformed not just the property, but the entire community of Cedar Ridge. What had begun as Martha's desperate attempt to save a failing cattle operation had evolved into a model for sustainable resource development that attracted attention from environmental groups, government, agencies, and indigenous rights organizations across the country. Jake's role as ranch liaison proved more complex and rewarding than either he or Martha had anticipated. Coordinating between cattle operations and underground mining required skills he'd never developed as a wandering cowboy. But the challenge of learning new techniques while preserving traditional ranching methods gave him a sense of purpose he'd been missing throughout his adult life. The underground mining shafts were engineered to avoid disrupting the ranch's water sources and grazing areas. Native Earth's commitment to environmental stewardship meant that every aspect of the operation was designed to maintain the land's agricultural productivity while extracting valuable minerals from deep below the surface. Martha found herself serving as an unofficial spokesperson for community-centered mining, speaking at conferences and workshops where other rural communities were exploring similar partnerships. Her journey from criminal fugitive to respected businesswoman was complete, though she rarely discussed the personal transformation that had made her current success possible. The financial impact of the mining partnership exceeded everyone's expectations. The initial signing bonus had indeed covered Martha's tax obligations to the IRS, but the ongoing royalty payments were generating more income than the ranch had ever produced through cattle ranching alone. Within 6 months, they'd been able to pay off all remaining debts and begin investing in ranch improvements that had been deferred for years. Jake used some of the mining income to purchase additional cattle and upgrade the ranch's infrastructure. New fencing, improved water systems, and modernized handling facilities allowed them to expand their herd while maintaining the high standards of animal care that Frank Henderson had established decades earlier. But the most significant change was the transformation of Cedar Ridge itself. Native Earth's commitment to community benefit had channeled a percentage of mining profits into local development projects that were revitalizing the entire region. The elementary school received new computers and science equipment, the volunteer fire department got modern emergency vehicles, and the town's main street was repaved for the first time in 20 years. The Copper Creek Saloon became an unofficial meeting place where ranchers, miners, and townspeople gathered to discuss the ongoing changes and plan future improvements. Jake found himself welcomed into conversations and decision-making processes that had previously been reserved for long-time residents with deep family roots in the community. Martha's integration into the social fabric of Cedar Ridge was more gradual but equally significant. Her reputation as a shrewd businesswoman who'd successfully navigated complex legal and financial challenges earned her respect from neighbors who'd initially been suspicious of her unusual marriage to Jake. The arrival of Dr. Elena Vasquez as the mining operations environmental coordinator brought an unexpected development to Jake and Martha's relationship. Dr. Vasquez was a hydrogeologist who'd been hired to monitor water quality and soil conditions throughout the extraction process, but her presence also served as a catalyst for conversations about the future that Jake and Martha had been avoiding. Dr. Vasquez was struck by the unusual dynamics of their marriage and the obvious affection that had developed between two people who'd begun their relationship as business partners. During her monthly site visits, she often joined them for dinner and gradually became a confidant for both Jake and Martha as they navigated the complexities of their evolving relationship. "You know," Dr. Vasquez observed during one of their conversations, "most business partnerships don't survive the kind of stress you've been through this year. The fact that you've grown closer rather than more distant suggests that your foundation is stronger than either of you realized." The comment forced Jake and Martha to acknowledge what had been obvious to everyone else for months. Their marriage of convenience had gradually become something deeper and more meaningful, though neither had been willing to risk their comfortable partnership by discussing romantic feelings. The conversation that finally addressed their changing relationship took place on Christmas Eve as they sat by the fireplace Frank had built with rocks from the mountains. Snow was falling outside, and the mining operation was quiet for the holiday, giving them the kind of peaceful evening they'd both learned to treasure. "I need to tell you something," Martha said, her voice carrying the same nervous tension she'd displayed when confessing her criminal past to the FBI agents. "This marriage stopped being about convenience for me months ago." Jake had been waiting for this conversation, without knowing how to initiate it himself. "For me too," he admitted, "but I wasn't sure you were ready to hear that, given everything else you've been dealing with." The acknowledgement of their feelings led to discussions about their future that went far beyond business partnerships and mining agreements. For the first time since their wedding day, they talked about personal dreams and plans that assumed they would remain together by choice rather than necessity. Martha revealed that she'd been considering options for giving back to the community that had welcomed her despite her complicated past. The mining income provided more financial security than she'd ever imagined, and she was interested in using some of that wealth to fund educational and economic development programs in rural Montana. Jake shared his own aspirations for expanding their ranching operation and perhaps mentoring young people who were interested in learning traditional livestock management techniques. The combination of mining income and agricultural expertise could support educational programs that would preserve ranching culture while adapting to modern economic realities. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Agent Rodriguez, who'd driven from Billings to deliver news about the final resolution of Martha's legal case. The federal investigation was officially complete, and all remaining questions about her activities in Chicago had been resolved in her favor. "The Department of Justice has closed your file," Rodriguez announced. "You're no longer under any form of federal investigation, and there are no remaining legal complications from your time with the Castellano organization." The news represented the final chapter of Martha's 30-year journey from criminal fugitive to respected community member. She was free to travel, invest, and engage in business activities without the constant fear of legal complications that had shadowed her entire adult life. But Rodriguez had also brought news about developments in Chicago that provided closure to that chapter of Martha's story. Vincent Castellanos' criminal organization had been completely dismantled through prosecutions that relied heavily on financial records and testimony from former associates who'd chosen cooperation over continued loyalty. The information you provided helped us understand how Castellanos' money laundering operation functioned, Rodriguez explained. Several other people who were trapped in similar situations came forward after learning about your immunity agreement. Your cooperation may have saved other lives. The revelation that her testimony had helped other people escape situations similar to her own experience with Castellano provided Martha with a sense of redemption that went beyond simple legal resolution. Her decision to cooperate with federal authorities had contributed to ending criminal activities that continued to harm other people decades after her own escape. Spring brought the official launch of the Henderson Ranch Education Center, a program funded by mining royalties and designed to teach sustainable ranching and environmental stewardship to young people throughout the region. Jake and Martha partnered with the local school district and Montana State University to create a curriculum that combined traditional agricultural knowledge with modern conservation techniques. The Education Center attracted students from across the western United States, including many from urban areas who'd never experienced rural life. The program's emphasis on hands-on learning and environmental responsibility created a model that other agricultural communities began replicating. Dr. Vasquez became the center's first director, bringing scientific expertise and educational experience that complemented Jake's practical knowledge and Martha's business acumen. Her leadership helped establish the program's reputation for excellence and ensured that environmental protection remained central to all educational activities. The success of the Education Center led to additional opportunities for community development. Native earth mining's profits were exceeding projections, generating surplus income that could be invested in regional infrastructure projects and economic diversification initiatives. Martha found herself appointed to the board of the newly created Cedar Ridge Development Corporation, a non-profit organization established to coordinate investment of mining profits in ways that would benefit the entire region. Her experience with financial management and her commitment to community welfare made her a natural leader for the organization. The Development Corporation's first major project was the establishment of a renewable energy cooperative that would provide clean electricity to rural communities throughout central Montana. Solar and wind installations, funded by mining profits, would reduce energy costs for residents, while demonstrating that extractive industries could contribute to environmental sustainability rather than environmental degradation. Jake's role in the Development Corporation focused on agricultural initiatives that would help local ranchers adapt to changing market conditions and environmental challenges. The combination of traditional ranching knowledge and mining income created opportunities for innovation that individual operations couldn't afford independently. The second anniversary of Jake and Martha's marriage was celebrated with a community festival that demonstrated how completely their unusual beginning had been embraced by their neighbors. The event featured traditional ranch activities, educational demonstrations from the Henderson Ranch Education Center, and presentations about sustainable mining practices that had attracted visitors from around the world. During the festival, Martha made an announcement that surprised even Jake. She decided to establish a scholarship fund for young women interested in business and finance careers, with particular emphasis on supporting students from rural communities who might not otherwise have access to higher education opportunities. I was given a second chance to build something positive from mistakes I made 30 years ago, Martha told the assembled crowd. These scholarships are my way of ensuring that other young women have first chances to pursue their dreams without the detours I took. The scholarship fund was endowed with $2 million from Martha's mining income, creating a permanent source of educational support that would benefit students for generations. The announcement drew national media attention and established Martha as a prominent advocate for rural education and women's economic empowerment. As the festival concluded and visitors departed, Jake and Martha walked across their property in the evening light, surveying land that had been transformed in ways neither of them could have imagined when they'd first shaken hands over coffee 2 years earlier. The cattle grazed peacefully in pastures that showed no signs of the intensive mining activity taking place hundreds of feet below. The ranch buildings had been renovated and expanded to accommodate the education center, but they maintained the character and functionality that Frank Henderson had established decades earlier. "Do you ever regret answering my advertisement?" Martha asked as they paused at the fence line where Jake had first evaluated the property's condition. Jake considered the question seriously. His life had been completely transformed by his decision to respond to Martha's unusual proposal, and not all of the changes had been comfortable or easy. But the man who drifted from ranch to ranch without finding a place where he belonged had discovered not just a home, but a purpose and community that fulfilled needs he'd never been able to articulate. "Not for a minute," he replied. "Though, I have to admit, if you'd mentioned the FBI investigation and the hidden millions in your original advertisement, I might have thought twice about responding." Martha laughed, the sound carrying across the pasture where their cattle were settling in for the night. "If I'd mentioned all that, you would have thought I was crazy, which, considering everything that's happened, might not have been entirely wrong." The conversation that followed covered ground they'd traveled many times during their 2 years together, but with the comfortable familiarity of people who'd learned to trust each other completely. They discussed plans for expanding the education center, strategies for the Development Corporation's renewable energy project, and dreams for their personal future that now extended far beyond the practical arrangements of their original marriage contract. As they walked back toward the house, where they now shared not just meals and daily responsibilities, but also the intimate partnership of two people who'd chosen to build a life together, Martha reflected on the journey that had brought her from the Copper Queen mine's hidden treasure to the legitimate wealth and community respect she now enjoyed. The woman who'd fled Chicago 30 years earlier with stolen money and false identification had become someone she could never have imagined. A respected businesswoman, community leader, and advocate for rural development who was using her resources to benefit others rather than simply protecting herself. Jake's transformation had been equally dramatic, though less visible to outside observers. The wandering cowboy, who'd never found a place where he belonged, had become a key figure in demonstrating that traditional ranching and modern environmental stewardship could coexist successfully. Their marriage, which had begun as a desperate business arrangement between strangers, had evolved into a partnership that encompassed not just personal affection, but shared values and common purpose that strengthened their community and inspired similar initiatives throughout the region. As they reached the house and prepared for another evening by the fireplace, Frank Henderson had built from mountain rocks. Both Jake and Martha understood that their story was just beginning. The foundation they'd built together would support whatever challenges and opportunities the future might bring, proving that second chances and unexpected partnerships could create outcomes more rewarding than either person could have achieved alone. 3 years after their wedding, an unexpected visitor arrived at the Henderson Ranch that would challenge everything Jake and Martha had built together. The woman who stepped out of a dusty sedan on a sweltering July afternoon bore a striking resemblance to Martha, though her expensive clothing and nervous manner suggested she came from a very different world. "My name is Angela Castellano," the woman announced when Martha answered the door. "Vincent Castellano was my father." The blood drained from Martha's face as she stared at the daughter of the man whose criminal organization had shaped the most dangerous period of her life. Angela was perhaps 35 years old, well-dressed but clearly exhausted with the kind of tension that comes from driving long distances while wrestling with difficult decisions. Jake appeared behind Martha, instinctively protective but uncertain, about the nature of the threat this unexpected visitor might represent. The name Castellano carried weight in their household, though they'd assumed that chapter of Martha's life was permanently closed. Angela explained that she'd spent months tracking down Maria Castaldi, the woman who'd disappeared from her father's organization 30 years earlier. Unlike the federal investigators who'd found Martha through facial recognition technology, Angela had followed a more personal trail of memories and family stories that had led her across the country. "I was 7 years old when you worked for my father," Angela said, as she accepted Martha's invitation to sit on the porch. "I remember you coming to our house for dinner sometimes. You were kind to me when the other adults ignored the children completely." The revelation that Vincent Castellano had occasionally invited his bookkeeper to family dinners added a personal dimension to Martha's Chicago experience that she'd never shared with Jake. The criminal organization that had seemed so threatening and impersonal had included moments of unexpected humanity. Angela's story unfolded slowly, revealed through careful questions and hesitant answers that painted a picture of a childhood spent in the shadow of criminal activity. She'd grown up knowing that her father's business was dangerous and illegal, but not understanding the full scope of his operations until she was old enough to connect disturbing events with their true causes. "I spent my entire childhood afraid that someone would kill my father or that the police would take him away," Angela explained. "When he died, I thought we were finally safe, but the legacy of his crimes has followed our family for 25 years. Vincent Castellano's death in a car accident had ended his criminal career, but not the consequences of his actions. Federal investigators had continued pursuing his associates and assets for decades, gradually dismantling the financial networks he'd established and prosecuting anyone who'd participated in his operations. Angela had grown up under constant scrutiny from law enforcement agencies that suspected her family retained hidden assets from Vincent's criminal activities. Despite having no involvement in her father's business, she'd found herself subjected to periodic investigations and financial audits that made normal life nearly impossible. "They've frozen my bank accounts 3 times in the past 5 years, Angela continued. "Every time I try to start a business or make investments, federal agents appear asking questions about money I've never seen and activities I never participated in." The harassment had intensified recently when new evidence emerged, suggesting that Vincent Castellano had hidden additional assets that remained undiscovered. Federal investigators believed that someone within his organization had helped him conceal money that could still be recovered, and they suspected that person might have maintained contact with his family. Angela's visit to the Henderson Ranch was prompted by her desperate hope that Martha might possess information about her father's hidden assets that could satisfy federal investigators and finally free the Castellano family from decades of suspicion and surveillance. "I don't want his money," Angela insisted. "I just want to live a normal life without federal agents questioning every financial transaction I make. If you know where he hid anything, please tell them. I'll sign whatever documents are necessary to renounce any claim to criminal proceeds." Martha listened to Angela's story with growing sympathy for a woman whose life had been shaped by circumstances beyond her control. The 7-year-old girl, who'd been kind to during family dinners, had grown into an adult who was paying the price for her father's crimes despite having no involvement in his criminal activities. But Martha's knowledge of Vincent Castellano's financial operations was limited to the specific money laundering schemes she'd been involved with. She'd never been trusted with information about his broader criminal empire or any hidden assets he might have accumulated independently. "I can tell you about the money I took when I left Chicago," Martha offered. "But that was returned to federal authorities 3 years ago. I don't know anything about other assets your father might have hidden." The conversation continued through the afternoon and into the evening, with Angela sharing family memories that provided Martha with a more complete picture of the man who'd employed her during those dangerous months in Chicago. Vincent Castellano had been a devoted father despite his criminal activities, creating a compartmentalized life that protected his family from the worst aspects of his business operations. Jake found himself drawn into discussions about loyalty, family responsibility, and the long-term consequences of criminal activity. Angela's situation demonstrated how criminal actions could harm innocent people for generations, creating cycles of suspicion and legal complications that extended far beyond the original perpetrators. Dr. Vasquez, who happened to be conducting a monthly environmental survey, joined their evening conversation and provided a perspective that proved crucial to understanding Angela's dilemma. Her background in scientific research had taught her to approach complex problems systematically, looking for solutions that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. "The real issue isn't whether additional money exists," Dr. Vasquez observed. "The problem is that federal investigators don't believe Vincent Castellano's financial empire has been completely dismantled. They'll continue harassing his family until they're convinced there's nothing left to recover." The insight led to a brainstorming session that extended well past midnight, with Jake, Martha, Angela, and Dr. Vasquez exploring strategies that might provide Angela with the closure she desperately needed. The solution they developed was audacious, risky, and completely dependent on Martha's willingness to once again cooperate with federal authorities. Martha proposed returning to Chicago to meet with the FBI agents who'd originally investigated Vincent Castellano's organization. She would offer to provide additional testimony about his operations in exchange for a formal declaration that his criminal empire had been completely dismantled and that his family was no longer under suspicion. "I worked closely with Vincent's money laundering operations," Martha explained. "If I can convince federal investigators that I've told them everything about his financial activities, they might be willing to close their investigation of his family permanently." The plan required Martha to risk reopening her own legal case and potentially exposing herself to new scrutiny from federal investigators. But her immunity agreement should protect her from prosecution, and her cooperation might provide Angela with the freedom she'd never experienced. Jake was uncomfortable with Martha's willingness to put herself at risk for someone they'd known for less than 24 hours. But he also understood that helping Angela represented an opportunity for Martha to address the guilt she still carried about her involvement in Vincent Castellano's criminal activities. The trip to Chicago was arranged for the following month, giving Martha time to coordinate with her attorney and prepare testimony that would satisfy federal investigators' remaining questions about Vincent Castellano's operations. Angela would accompany her, providing a family perspective that might help convince authorities that the Castellano investigation could finally be concluded. Dr. Vasquez volunteered to serve as an independent witness to their meetings with federal agents, using her scientific credentials and objective perspective to document any agreements reached between Martha and the government. Her involvement would provide additional protection against any attempts to misrepresent the scope of Martha's cooperation. The weeks leading up to their Chicago trip were filled with preparation that reminded Jake of the intensive research Rodriguez had conducted before negotiating Martha's original immunity agreement. Every aspect of Vincent Castellano's operations had to be reviewed and documented to ensure Martha's testimony would be complete and accurate. Angela proved to be an invaluable resource during this preparation phase. Her childhood memories of her father's associates and business activities provided context that helped Martha reconstruct details she'd forgotten over the decades. Together, they created a comprehensive picture of Castellano's criminal empire that went far beyond Martha's limited role as bookkeeper. The collaborative effort of preparing for the federal meetings also created an unexpected bond between Martha and Angela. Despite the 30-year age difference and their vastly different life experiences, they discovered a shared understanding of the psychological burden that comes from being connected to criminal activity, even as unwilling participants. "I've spent my entire adult life trying to prove I'm not my father," Angela confided during one of their preparation sessions. "But every time I think I've escaped his shadow, something happens to remind me that other people still see me as Vincent." Castellano's daughter. Martha recognized the struggle Angela described, though her own experience had involved creating a completely new identity rather than trying to rehabilitate an existing one. The techniques Martha had developed for managing guilt and building legitimate success despite criminal associations became valuable guidance for Angela's own journey toward freedom. The Chicago meetings took place in the same federal building where Martha had first been questioned about her involvement with Vincent Castellano's organization. But instead of being interrogated as a suspect, she was welcomed as a cooperative witness whose testimony could help resolve one of the Bureau's longest-running investigations. Special Agent Sarah Martinez, who'd inherited the Castellano case from the agents who'd originally questioned Martha, expressed appreciation for Martha's willingness to provide additional cooperation that could finally close the investigation. The Bureau had been under pressure to conclude cases that had consumed resources for decades without producing actionable intelligence. Martha's testimony filled gaps in the federal understanding of Vincent Castellano's money laundering operations that had prevented them from declaring the investigation complete. Her detailed knowledge of specific transactions and financial relationships provided the comprehensive picture investigators needed to confirm they'd recovered all significant assets. Angela's participation in the meetings provided a family perspective that convinced federal agents the Castellano family had no knowledge of hidden assets or ongoing criminal activities. Her obvious relief at finally being able to discuss her father's crimes openly demonstrated that she'd been victimized by his legacy rather than benefiting from it. The formal agreement reached at the conclusion of their Chicago meetings provided both women with the closure they'd been seeking. Martha received updated documentation confirming that her cooperation had been complete and that she faced no future legal complications from her involvement with Vincent Castellano's organization. Angela received a letter from the Department of Justice stating that the investigation of Vincent Castellano's criminal empire was officially concluded and that his family members were no longer considered subjects of federal scrutiny. The document would allow her to pursue normal business and personal activities without the constant threat of law enforcement intervention. Dr. Vasquez documented the entire process, creating an independent record that would protect both women against any future attempts to reopen investigations they'd worked so hard to conclude. Her scientific approach to evidence documentation provided additional credibility to their agreements with federal authorities. The return trip to Montana was markedly different from their anxious journey to Chicago. Angela's transformation from nervous fugitive to liberated woman was visible in her posture, her conversation, and her plans for a future that no longer included federal investigations as a constant threat. "I can finally start living my own life, instead of running from my father's mistakes," Angela said as they watched the prairie landscape roll past their train windows. For the first time in 30 years, I'm free to make my own choices without worrying about how they'll be interpreted by federal investigators. Angela's visit to the Henderson Ranch was extended by 2 weeks as she explored opportunities to build a new life in Montana. The wide open spaces and tight-knit communities of rural America appealed to someone who'd spent her entire life under urban scrutiny and suspicion. Martha and Jake offered Angela a position with the Henderson Ranch Education Center, where her business background and personal experience with the consequences of criminal activity could contribute to programs that helped young people understand the importance of ethical decision-making. The offer represented more than just employment. It provided Angela with the opportunity to transform her father's negative legacy into positive contributions to community education and development. Her acceptance marked the beginning of a new chapter that would benefit not just her own healing, but also the lives of students who would learn from her experiences. As Angela settled into her new role and life in Cedar Ridge, Jake reflected on how their unusual family had expanded to include someone whose connection to Martha's past had initially seemed threatening, but ultimately proved beneficial to everyone involved. The Henderson Ranch, which had begun as Martha's refuge from criminal associations, had become a place where people with complicated histories could find redemption and build positive futures. Angela's integration into their community demonstrated that second chances could extend beyond individual transformation to healing relationships damaged by historical conflicts. The 5th anniversary of Jake and Martha's marriage brought an invitation that would challenge their carefully constructed life in ways neither had anticipated. The letter arrived on official letterhead from the University of Chicago's Business School, requesting Martha's participation in a symposium on corporate ethics and financial accountability. Professor David Chen, who'd been researching the long-term impact of financial crimes on both perpetrators and victims, had learned about Martha's unique journey from criminal participant to community leader through federal case files that had recently been declassified. Her transformation represented exactly the kind of redemption story he wanted to include in his academic research. Your experience demonstrates that people involved in financial crimes can become positive forces for ethical business practices. Professor Chen wrote, "We'd like you to speak about how personal accountability and community engagement can break cycles of criminal behavior." The invitation forced Martha to confront questions about public disclosure of her past that she'd successfully avoided for years. Speaking at a major university would make her story part of the public record, potentially exposing her to scrutiny from people who might not understand the complexity of her situation. Jake understood Martha's reluctance to accept the speaking engagement, but he also recognized the potential benefits of sharing her experience with students who might face similar ethical dilemmas in their own careers. Her story could serve as a powerful warning about how easily intelligent people could become involved in criminal activities. Angela supported the idea enthusiastically, arguing that Martha's visibility as a reformed criminal could provide hope for other people struggling with the consequences of past mistakes. Her own experience with federal harassment had taught her the value of advocates who understood the system from personal experience. The debate over Professor Chen's invitation continued for weeks, with Martha weighing the risks of public exposure against the potential benefits of educating others about financial crime prevention. Dr. Vasquez contributed scientific perspective about the documented benefits of sharing traumatic experiences as part of the healing process. Martha's decision to accept the speaking engagement was ultimately influenced by a letter from a young woman named Rebecca Torres, who'd read about the Henderson Ranch Education Center in a magazine article about sustainable mining practices. Rebecca was a recent college graduate struggling with student loan debt who'd been offered a high-paying job with a company she suspected might be involved in illegal activities. "I don't know who else to ask for advice," Rebecca wrote. "You've built something positive after making mistakes, and I hope you can help me avoid making similar choices. The money they're offering would solve all my financial problems, but I'm afraid of what they might expect me to do to earn it." The letter reminded Martha that her experience could provide guidance for people facing the same ethical challenges that had led to her involvement with Vincent Castellanos' organization. Young professionals struggling with financial pressures needed to hear from someone who understood the long-term consequences of choosing immediate financial gain over ethical behavior. Martha's preparation for the University of Chicago speech required her to articulate lessons from her experience in ways that would be meaningful to business students without glorifying criminal activity or minimizing its harmful consequences. The process forced her to examine aspects of her past that she'd preferred to leave unexamined. Jake accompanied Martha to Chicago, providing moral support during what would be her first public discussion of her criminal past. The city where she'd once lived in fear had changed dramatically over the intervening decades, but returning to familiar neighborhoods stirred memories that had been dormant for years. The symposium attracted an audience of business students, faculty members, and professionals interested in corporate ethics and financial accountability. Martha's presentation was part of a day-long program that included reformed white-collar criminals, federal prosecutors, and academic researchers, studying the psychology of financial crimes. Martha's speech focused on the gradual nature of ethical compromise and the importance of recognizing warning signs before becoming deeply involved in criminal activities. She described how her involvement with Vincent Castellanos' organization had begun with seemingly minor irregularities that escalated into major money laundering operations. "I didn't wake up one morning and decide to become a criminal," Martha told the audience. "I made a series of small compromises that seemed reasonable at the time, but eventually led me into activities I would never have chosen if I'd understood where they were heading." The presentation included specific examples of how financial pressures and professional ambitions could cloud ethical judgment, making illegal activities seem like acceptable solutions to legitimate problems. Martha's description of her gradual involvement in money laundering provided a case study in how good people could make bad choices when faced with difficult circumstances. The question and answer session following Martha's presentation revealed the depth of interest in her story and the practical applications of her experience. Students asked detailed questions about recognizing red flags in job offers, dealing with financial pressure without compromising ethical standards, and rebuilding professional credibility after making serious mistakes. One particularly poignant question came from a student whose family had been affected by financial crimes similar to those Martha had participated in. The young man's father had lost his retirement savings to an investment scam that involved money laundering operations like those Martha had helped facilitate. "How do you live knowing that your actions hurt innocent people?" the student asked. "My family still hasn't recovered from what happened to us." Martha's response was honest about the psychological burden she continued to carry and the ways she'd tried to make amends through community service and financial contributions to organizations that helped crime victims. But she also acknowledged that some consequences of criminal activity could never be fully repaired. "I can't undo the harm my actions caused," Martha replied, "but I can use my experience to help other people avoid making similar mistakes, and I can dedicate my resources to supporting communities and causes that represent the values I should have upheld from the beginning." The symposium's impact extended far beyond the university auditorium where Martha delivered her presentation. Video recordings of her speech were made available online, where they attracted attention from business schools, law enforcement agencies, and professional organizations interested in ethics training. Martha's story became part of a broader conversation about corporate accountability and the personal responsibility of individuals who become involved in white-collar crimes. Her emphasis on community engagement as a path to redemption challenged traditional approaches to criminal justice that focus primarily on punishment rather than rehabilitation. The positive response to Martha's presentation led to additional speaking invitations from universities, professional associations, and government agencies interested in her perspective on financial crime prevention. What had begun as a single speech evolved into a new career as an ethics consultant and public speaker. Jake found himself managing Martha's speaking schedule and travel arrangements, coordinating her public appearances with their ongoing responsibilities at the ranch and the education center. Her growing prominence as an expert on financial ethics created opportunities to influence policy discussions at state and federal levels. Angela's role at the Henderson Ranch Education Center expanded to include coordination of ethical leadership, programs that incorporated lessons from both Martha's and her own experiences with the consequences of criminal activity. The programs attracted students from across the country who wanted to learn about responsible business practices, the transformation of the Henderson Ranch from a struggling cattle operation into a center for sustainable mining, agricultural education, and ethical leadership demonstrated the potential for positive change when people with complicated histories were given opportunities to contribute to their communities. Martha's public speaking career also created opportunities to address broader issues affecting rural communities throughout the American West. Her combination of business expertise, criminal justice experience, and community development success made her a sought-after consultant for economic development projects. The renewable energy cooperative she'd helped establish through the Cedar Ridge Development Corporation became a model for similar projects in other mining communities. Her advocacy for community-centered resource development influenced policy discussions about the role of extractive industries in supporting sustainable economic growth. But Martha's increasing prominence also attracted attention from people who questioned whether someone with her criminal background should be advising others about ethical behavior. Critical articles appeared in business publications that argued her past disqualified her from serving as a moral authority on financial practices. The controversy reached a crescendo when a group of crime victims' advocates organized protests outside one of Martha's speaking engagements, arguing that she was profiting from her criminal notoriety while their families continued to suffer from similar crimes. Jake watched Martha struggle with the criticism, understanding that her critics had legitimate grievances even if they didn't fully understand her current circumstances. The public scrutiny was more intense than anything she'd experienced during her years of hiding, and it tested her commitment to using her experience for positive purposes. The resolution of the controversy came through an unexpected source. Several former FBI agents who'd investigated Martha's case wrote public letters defending her cooperation with federal authorities and her contributions to preventing similar crimes. Their endorsements carried weight with law enforcement communities and crime victims groups. Agent Rodriguez, who'd originally negotiated Martha's immunity agreement, became one of her strongest public supporters, arguing that her transformation demonstrated the potential for criminal justice reform that emphasized rehabilitation and community contribution over purely punitive measures. Martha Henderson represents exactly the kind of outcome we hope to achieve through cooperation agreements, Rodriguez wrote in a letter to the editor of a major business publication. She's used her experience to help solve crimes, educate potential victims, and contribute to her community in ways that have prevented far more harm than her original crimes caused. The support from law enforcement officials helped shift public opinion about Martha's role as an ethics advocate. Media coverage began focusing on the positive impact of her community development work and the practical value of her insights about financial crime prevention. Martha's response to the controversy demonstrated the emotional growth she'd achieved since her days as a frightened fugitive hiding in rural Montana. Instead of retreating from public view, she used the criticism as an opportunity to address broader questions about redemption, accountability, and the potential for positive change. "I understand why some people question my right to speak about ethics," Martha said during a television interview addressing the controversy. "I don't expect forgiveness from everyone I've harmed, and I don't claim to be perfect now. But I do know something about how good people can make terrible choices, and I believe that knowledge can help others avoid similar mistakes." The television appearance marked a turning point in Martha's public career, establishing her as someone who could address criticism honestly while maintaining her commitment to community service and education. Her willingness to accept responsibility for past actions while continuing to contribute positively to society resonated with audiences struggling with their own ethical challenges. The controversy also strengthened Martha's relationship with Jake, who'd stood by her throughout the public scrutiny despite the personal costs of being associated with someone under media criticism. His unwavering support reminded Martha that she'd found not just professional redemption, but also personal happiness with someone who understood her completely. As Martha's 5th year in Montana drew to a close, she reflected on the journey that had taken her from criminal fugitive to respected community leader and public advocate for ethical behavior. The path had been neither straight nor easy, but it had led to a life that was more meaningful and fulfilling than anything she could have imagined when she'd first placed her advertisement for a husband in the Billings Gazette. The Henderson Ranch had become more than just their home. It had evolved into a symbol of the potential for positive transformation when people with complicated histories were given opportunities to contribute to their communities. The mining operation, education center, and development corporation all demonstrated that wealth could be used to build rather than destroy. Jake's own transformation from wandering cowboy to community leader and business partner reflected the same potential for growth and positive change that had characterized Martha's journey. Their marriage, which had begun as a practical arrangement between strangers, had become a partnership that strengthened both of them while contributing to the welfare of everyone around them. The anniversary celebration for their 5th year of marriage brought together friends and colleagues from across the country who'd been touched by their story and inspired by their work. The gathering demonstrated how far they'd traveled from the simple ceremony in Judge Carmichael's chambers that had legally joined two people who barely knew each other. As guests shared stories about the impact of the Henderson Ranch Education Center, the Renewable Energy Cooperative, and Martha's ethics advocacy, Jake and Martha realized that their unusual beginning had led to achievements that neither could have accomplished alone. Their partnership had created something larger than the sum of its parts, benefiting communities and individuals far beyond their original expectations. 10 years after Jake Morrison first answered Martha Henderson's unusual advertisement in the Billings Gazette, their story had become something neither could have imagined during those first awkward conversations at Murphy's Diner. The small ranch that had been struggling to survive had transformed into the headquarters of a movement that was reshaping how rural communities approached economic development and social responsibility. The Henderson Foundation, established with proceeds from the mining partnership and Martha's speaking career, had become one of the largest charitable organizations in Montana. Its programs supported ethical business education, rural economic development, and assistance for families affected by white-collar crimes. The foundation's annual budget exceeded $20 million, all of which was directed toward communities and causes that reflected the values Jake and Martha had developed together. Martha's transformation from criminal fugitive to respected philanthropist had been documented in a book written by Professor Chen, whose original invitation to speak at the University of Chicago had launched her public career. Second Chances: How One Woman's Journey from Crime to Community Leadership Redefined Redemption became required reading in business ethics courses across the country. The book's success brought national media attention that elevated Martha's influence beyond academic circles. She was invited to testify before congressional committees examining corporate accountability, consulted by federal agencies developing white-collar crime prevention programs, and featured in documentaries about criminal justice reform. Jake's role had evolved from ranch hand to executive director of the Henderson Foundation, where his practical experience and genuine concern for community welfare made him an effective advocate for the foundation's programs. His transformation from wandering cowboy to respected philanthropist demonstrated that second chances could benefit people whose backgrounds were more conventional than Martha's. Angela Castellano had become the foundation's director of victim services, using her personal experience with the long-term consequences of financial crimes to develop programs that helped families navigate the complex legal and emotional challenges that followed white-collar criminal activity. Her work had helped hundreds of families rebuild their lives after being devastated by investment fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering schemes. The Henderson Ranch Education Center had grown into a nationally recognized institution that attracted students, researchers, and policymakers from around the world. Its programs demonstrated that environmental stewardship, economic development, and social responsibility could coexist successfully when communities approached resource management with long-term vision and ethical commitment. Dr. Vasquez had been promoted to Dean of the Center's Research Division, where she led studies on sustainable mining practices, renewable energy development, and rural community resilience. Her scientific approach to evaluating the social and environmental impacts of the Henderson model provided data that influenced resource management policies throughout the American West. The 10th anniversary celebration brought together an extraordinary collection of people whose lives had been touched by Jake and Martha's unlikely partnership. Former federal agents stood alongside reformed criminals, rural ranchers mingled with university professors, and crime victims shared stories with philanthropists who'd funded their recovery programs. Agent Rodriguez, now retired from the FBI, served as master of ceremonies for the anniversary dinner. His remarks captured the profound transformation that had occurred not just in Jake and Martha's lives, but in the broader understanding of how criminal justice could emphasize rehabilitation and community contribution. 10 years ago, Martha Henderson was someone we were investigating for her involvement in financial crimes, Rodriguez told the assembled crowd. Today, she's someone we consult when we want to understand how to prevent those same crimes from occurring. That transformation didn't happen by accident. It happened because she chose to use her experience to benefit others rather than simply protecting herself. The evening's most moving moment came when Rebecca Torres, the young woman whose letter had influenced Martha's decision to speak publicly about her past, was introduced as the newest member of the Henderson Foundation's board of directors. Rebecca had built a successful career in ethical business consulting, crediting Martha's guidance with helping her avoid the financial pressures that might have led to poor decisions. Martha saved me from making the same mistake she made. Rebecca explained to the audience. But more than that, she showed me that it's possible to build a meaningful career based on helping others rather than just accumulating wealth. As the formal program concluded and guests moved to the ranch's outdoor pavilion for dancing and continued conversation, Jake and Martha found themselves alone on the porch, where they'd shared so many important discussions over the years. The view across their property showed lights from the education center, the mining operations administrative buildings, and the homes of families who'd moved to Cedar Ridge to work in the various enterprises their partnership had created. Do you ever wonder what Frank would think of all this? Jake asked, gesturing toward the bustling activity that had replaced the quiet isolation of their early marriage. Martha considered the question seriously. Frank Henderson had been a man who valued both tradition and progress, someone who'd recognized that the land could support purposes beyond simple cattle ranching. The mineral rights strategy he'd developed suggested he'd always envisioned the ranch evolving into something larger than a family operation. "I think he'd be amazed by how far we've come," Martha replied. "But I also think he'd approve of the way we've tried to balance economic development with community benefit. He loved this land, but he also understood that love sometimes means allowing things to change and grow." The conversation turned to their personal relationship and the unexpected depth of affection that had developed between two people who'd begun their marriage as strangers, seeking mutual convenience. Neither had anticipated that their business arrangement would evolve into genuine partnership built on shared values and complementary strengths. "I need to tell you something I've never said before," Martha said, taking Jake's hand as they watched the celebration continue around them. "When I placed that advertisement in the newspaper, I was looking for someone to help me save the ranch. I never imagined I might find someone who would help me save myself." Jake understood what Martha meant. Their marriage had provided both of them with something more valuable than financial security or social respectability. It had given them the opportunity to become better versions of themselves while contributing to something larger than their individual needs. "We've been lucky," Jake replied, "not just because everything worked out financially, but because we found each other at exactly the right time in our lives. I was ready to stop wandering, and you were ready to stop hiding." The insight captured the essence of their successful partnership. Both had reached points in their lives where they were prepared to commit to building something positive rather than simply protecting themselves from further disappointment or danger. As the anniversary celebration continued into the late evening, Jake and Martha moved among their guests, accepting congratulations and sharing stories about the various projects and programs that had grown from their initial partnership. The gathering demonstrated how their personal transformation had created ripple effects that benefited hundreds of other people. The evening concluded with an announcement that surprised even some of their closest associates. Martha revealed that she and Jake had decided to donate the ranch itself to the Henderson Foundation, ensuring that the property would continue serving educational and charitable purposes in perpetuity. "This land gave us the opportunity to build something meaningful together," Martha explained. "By making it a permanent part of the Foundation's assets, we're ensuring that future generations will have the same opportunities for growth and contribution that we've been blessed to experience." The donation represented the final step in Martha's transformation, from someone who'd stolen money to protect herself into someone who was giving away wealth to benefit others. The ranch that had been her refuge would become a permanent resource for people seeking their own second chances. Jake and Martha's plans for their remaining years together focused on mentoring other couples and individuals who were facing challenging transitions in their lives. Their experience demonstrated that unconventional partnerships could succeed when built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and commitment to community welfare. The Henderson Ranch would continue operating under the foundation's management, with Jake and Martha remaining as advisors and occasional residents. But they were also planning to travel, speaking at conferences and consulting with organizations that wanted to replicate their model of community-centered development. As their 10th anniversary celebration wound down and guests began departing for homes across the country, Jake and Martha stood together on the porch where their relationship had deepened through countless conversations about everything from cattle prices to criminal justice reform. The journey that had begun with a simple newspaper advertisement had led them through federal investigations, mining negotiations, family reconciliation, public controversy, and philanthropic success. Along the way, they discovered that second chances could lead to achievements that surpassed anything either had accomplished during their first attempts at building meaningful lives. The ranch around them bore little resemblance to the struggling Operation Jake had first evaluated a decade earlier, but the values that had guided their transformation, honesty, hard work, community service, and mutual support, remained the same principles that had attracted them to each other in the first place. Martha's removal of her silver wig on their wedding night had revealed more than just the hidden fortune that enabled their subsequent success. It had marked the beginning of a relationship built on complete honesty about their pasts and shared commitment to building a future that honored the best aspects of their individual experiences while transcending the limitations of their previous lives. Their story had become proof that unusual beginnings could lead to extraordinary outcomes when people were willing to trust each other completely and work together toward goals that benefited their entire community. The cowboy who'd married a 60-year-old bride with secrets had discovered that love, purpose, and prosperity could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances when approached with courage, integrity, and genuine care for others. As they prepared to begin their second decade together, Jake and Martha knew that their greatest adventures still lay ahead, not because they were seeking new challenges, but because they'd learned that meaningful relationships and purposeful work created opportunities for growth and contribution that could last a lifetime. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.